Hello everyone, I'm Christy Risk, Senior Editor at GenomeWeb, and I'll be your moderator for today. The title of today's webinar is Uncovering Genomic Evidence of SARS-CoV-2 Infection and Reinfection, and our sponsor is QIAGEN. Our panelist for today is Dr. Joel Sevinsky, Principal at Theiagen Consulting, and Dr. Leif Schauser, Associate Director of Global Product Management for Biomedical Genomics at QIAGEN.
Great, thank you, Christy, and thank you, Leif, for the invitation to talk today. What I'm going to talk about today was the work that I was involved with at the Nevada State Public Health Laboratory and looking at one of the first confirmed reinfection cases internationally and the first one in the US. You can see the title there. And the first slide I'm going to put up just the legal disclaimer for QIAGEN, and then here's our overview. So I'm going to give a little bit of the background about US public health, and their NGS activities, bioinformatics prior to the pandemic, and then dive into, the early pandemic and the reinfection story, and then go more into the NGS activities, kind of the mid to late pandemic, if this is considered, God willing, late pandemic right now, and maybe what the post-pandemic vision looks like. So if I go back in time, just to 2019, so right before the pandemic, I've been involved in systems biology for a couple decades, but in public health, bioinformatics, and NGS for about 5 years. And, right before the pandemic, public health was really embracing NGS and bioinformatics, but it was happening at a slower rate than it is right now. You had a lot of work going on with predominantly bacterial pathogens. Many of you might be familiar with PulseNet for enteric surveillance and the successes they're having in detecting smaller outbreaks and detecting them earlier using NGS bioinformatics. There's a lot of other projects in Legionella and HAIs, but there's very, very little metagenomics in the year 2019 in public health. And there might be some small pilot projects that public health labs are testing out. And there's pretty minimal viral sequencing. There's going to be some Hep A, some norovirus, other pilot projects for measles and mumps, but no system-wide capabilities for viral sequencing. Furthermore, from a platform perspective in public health, there was one major manufacturer involved in sequencing instruments for a lot of public health labs. And it was predominantly Illumina, predominantly the MiSeq instrumentation, very little Oxford Nanopore or Clear Labs or the other types of companies that you hear about today. And, most of those other technologies were more in kind of the research space. And, looking forward, maybe in a couple of years, we'll have these routinely in a public health laboratory. And so against that backdrop, when you go into 2020 and you have the beginning of this pandemic, and then, public health laboratories and universities and the international community start sequencing, in the US, what was the rationale for the sequencing of SARS-CoV-2? And, one of the things I don't have on here is I have a missing acknowledgement where some of this came from the Genomic Epi Toolkit, which is referenced on slide 21 if you have the PDF, and you'll see it later. But, what was the rationale for sequencing SARS-CoV-2 in the US? Well, there's kind of two ways you can look at that. One is at the national level, and the other one's at a state and local level. Well, at the national level, you're definitely looking at strain surveillance, right? And I think a lot of us that are familiar with this field, we can remember the early stories of the first spike protein mutation that became well known, which is the D614G. That was obviously detected through a lot of this genomic surveillance, NGS bioinformatics. And you also wanted, to sequence the rationale to help guide diagnostic and vaccine development. And then at the state and local level, you're mainly looking at ways to supplement control efforts, to better understand the epidemiology and identify clusters. We could think back to the, what I think of as the first big outbreak in the US was the nursing home in Washington. And then, that's where a lot of the early sequences, if you look in GISAID, are from the Washington area and sequenced by the CDC. But then also there's investigating some of these really big outbreaks or super spreader events. I believe the Broad Institute has a paper out on a super spreader event in Boston area in early 2020. And then, a lot of this early pandemic, we were really focused on, is reinfection a possibility? And NGS and bioinformatics is the tool that's going to, I believe, definitively show whether that's, going to happen or not. So that was the rationale, but what was the status of sequencing of SARS-CoV-2 in the U.S. public health community? Well, for 2020, as you can see from this graph, which kindly the data was provided by Duncan McCannell. He saved me many hours. We already had this data where he compiled it manually through GISAID. But if you look at genome submissions from U.S. laboratories throughout the year 2020, it's pretty linear, and there's not a lot of it, right? And there's a reason for this, where most public health laboratories, especially in the early 2020 through the summer, they were completely overwhelmed with diagnostic testing. I mean, this became a, to kind of think of a meme, this was kind of like a dumpster fire where it was all hands on deck. You have a public health system that didn't receive the funding that it needed for a couple decades, and then they're dealing with an overwhelming pandemic. So even if you had sequencing capacity, which most labs did for PulseNet, you probably didn't have the personnel available for sequencing because, the public health labs literally had to steal every person who is talented in molecular biology to work on diagnostic testing. And as a result, very few laboratories were sequencing SARS-CoV-2 in that spring, summer of 2020. And I kind of liken it to, for me, I am very focused on NGS and bioinformatics. I no longer really work in the diagnostic section. And I can remember, I work with a lot of public health laboratories. I do a lot of training in the US. And I can remember in spring of 2020, it was kind of like everybody disappeared for a couple months. Nobody was interested in NGS and bioinformatics because they were dealing with this pandemic. And I kind of liken it to, it's kind of like when a tsunami's coming and you have the drawback of the ocean, like that ebbing out. And I didn't realize it at the time. What I was watching was the drawback of NGS and bioinformatics because of this tsunami event, this pandemic, and then it was going to get overwhelmed, NGS and bioinformatics for this pandemic. Okay. So background, 2020. So given this background, how did we even find a reinfection case in Nevada? And some of this goes to that old saying, luck favors the prepared. So at Nevada State Public Health Laboratory, they were collaborating with the University of Nevada, Reno on a sequencing protocol for SARS-CoV-2. And this provided them with the personnel capacity for sequencing because they were not using state public health personnel, they were using their university collaboration. And Nevada State Public Health Laboratory, in particular Mark Pandori, the director there, had also asked the epidemiologists to actively look for reinfection cases. So they knew this was a possibility. Mark has background in virology. It really, for anybody in this kind of field, it wasn't really a matter of, is this a possibility, or if it's going to happen, it's a matter of when it's going to happen. And they're also very careful about preserving positive specimens for sequencing. Now, one thing, I know I'm going to get questions about this at the end, and from a public, when you're thinking about these types of case studies that come out of public health work, out of public health specimens, public health laboratories, they're not research institutes. They don't perform research. They don't perform studies. What they do is they perform testing, and they can save specimens. So a lot of times, somebody might, at the end of this webinar, ask me, well, was this individual the first time they were tested, did they do an antibody test to see if they had any antibody production? And the answer is going to be no, because that wasn't the goal of this. The goal was to diagnose them positive or negative, and you have so many specimens coming in. These are things that you can't afford to do for every specimen, and it's not going to be done. So if we get into the case definition, this will describe how this came about. So originally, you have a 25-year-old Latino male who had an initial symptom onset in March 25, 2020. And the initial collection date was April 18th, and the specimen was sent to the Nevada State Public Health Laboratory. And this is pretty routine for public health. So the case investigation was completed. Once the positive results were reported, and it was reported to Washoe County Health District. They had resolution of symptoms on the 27th, and their place of employment requested test-based strategy to return to work. And then they had 2 negative specimens collected May 9th and May 26th. Now, this was an important criteria that Nevada had set up when trying to look for reinfection cases, is they wanted the negative testing in between. They didn't want something where somebody was tested 1 month and then 3 months later they still test positives. They really wanted those negative testing in between as a key criteria. And then on May 28th, after their second negative test, they developed a fever, cough, shortness of breath. And what was interesting about this one is it was worse than previously experienced. Interestingly, a co-inhabitant was unwell at the time, and I'll talk more about that in a second.
QIAGEN.
Sample to insight.